scientifically. So we'll get into that today with looking at these patterns. So I've retitled it, and I can go to the presentation now.
Sure.
Or is
Yeah,
it's already up. It's already up. Okay. I'm
yeah.
just going to make my screen bigger so I can see it. So yeah. So I'm calling it 100 data patterns evidencing the priority of Marcion's gospel, or, and this is, tongue in cheek, for all you proto-Orthodox parrots, many things we deemeth Marcion doth hateth. And you'll see as we go through, like, the more data patterns we look at, and I'm not going to like break out the statistics in this presentation. This is more for a mass audience, just to show, like, when you look carefully at the data of Marcion's gospel versus canonical Luke, you just see these patterns over and over and over again. And often they're clustered, right? It's not just one data pattern you see like occurring, and then other data patterns occur in other places. Like, you see cluster after cluster after cluster, 10, 20, 30 features all clustered together in a verse or in two verses. So that's what data scientists look for. It's, non-random patterns in data. And then they look for clustering of those patterns. So I think that's what the data shows. So here's a reference to my book. It's open access. Eventually I might, print portions of it or submit portions of it as journal articles, but because this was so brand new and I'm really trying to pioneer a whole new method, I didn't want to wait like 3 years, which is usually what it takes to get stuff published in religious studies. I just wanted to move forward, get the stuff out there, get people talking about it. And then if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Like, correct me, show me where I'm wrong. But I'm just going to continue to, and I think it's publicly important. Like this, if I'm on the right track, this is a significant contribution to not only the discipline of New Testament studies, but to science.
Yeah.
And so I just want to get this out there, and I want to get people talking about it. And I don't want to do it by myself. I want to work on a team of people who can scrutinize this, who can evaluate it, tell me if I'm wrong, and I want to constantly improve it too. So this book, I basically release a new version of it about every month. So if there are any like additions, corrections, somebody on a bulletin board recently was mentioning like Gospel of Thomas traditions. I don't fully account for all of those in my footnotes. And that person is absolutely right. Like, I haven't gone through all the Thomas stuff and fully integrated it into the book yet. So that's something I need to do. So that, to me, it's kind of like software development. It's like a future improvement cycle. In the book, as this evolves, I will add that stuff in, eventually. So here's the challenge, scientific challenge. How can we identify and validate non-random patterns within and across many diffuse data sets of the earliest Christian texts? And what I found looking at Marcion's gospel is, we had about 10 major reconstructions throughout history, but every editor just did his own thing. Like, if you look, if you look at August Hahn, he did the first one, or Theodor Zahn, or Adolf von Harnack, or whatever. Each one was using a completely idiosyncratic method in terms of representing the data, right? We'll use parentheses for this, or brackets for that, or, triangle lines for this, or italics for that, or bold for this. And if you get to Roth's, he has, I think I counted up 19 different indications or typographical conventions to show different kinds of things. So like, very, very confident, not so confident, it just gets to the point where, like, this is crazy, right? This data is so muddled, it's so confusing, it's so idiosyncratic that you can't actually compare it scientifically. And I want to think the best about people, but it to me, is looking at this in terms as like, part of my background is information science, data science, database management. Like, this data is just a mess. Like, there's no way you can build this into a scientific experiment or do scientific analysis or correlations on it. So to me, like, the main problem in the discipline, it's not, like, we need to look at these texts and take them seriously, but we can debate until our heads turn red. But if we don't have solid data to start, it's garbage in, garbage out, or whatever you want to call it. Like, if you don't have solid data to start with, you can't even begin to have a serious scientific conversation about this. So the first task that I set out to do, or one of the first tasks I set out to do after releasing my hypotheses and all this, was just normalize the data. Like, let's take this mess, like super, idiosyncratic mess of data, and then distill it into consistent data where all the data, like, you can make apples to apples comparisons where all the data means the same thing. So that's what I did. And these all went through peer review. So it went to the Journal of Open Humanities Data. Its editor-in-chief, I mentioned this in a previous presentation on Jacob's channel. It's Barbara McGillivray. She's at the Turing Institute at Cambridge and at King's College London. She's one of the most eminent computational linguists in the world.
Wow.
Oversees a major project called the Diaeresis, which is a huge compendium of Greek, digital text, richly tagged, richly annotated Greek text that lets people do like sophisticated analysis about linguistic patterns in Greek over time. Like, how does the Greek language evolve, and what does
Oh,
it look
wow.
like in different places? Right. It's
Yeah.
basically like a 1,000-year compendium of Greek literature that lets you
Yeah.
do this really
Like,
rigorous
what does Ionian Greek sound like in 542 BC? Like,
versus
versus
what did
yeah,
Attic Greek sound like, 100 years later
right.
versus
And
what did
you'd be surprised how often it changes.
languages constantly evolve.
Yeah, every 100 years. It's always,
And that's why it's so important. Like, if you want to date writings and you don't have external date references, one of the best things you can do is look at linguistic pattern from the broader environment. If people were saying groovy a lot in the 1960s and 70s, and then you see groovy all over a text, it's probably not written in the 40s or 50s. It's probably written after the 60s or 70s, right? And where is it written? Like, if that word's more popular in Australia the last 10 years, like maybe this text is Australian as often as it's using the word group, right? So
yeah, yeah.
we need to, like,
It's
that's
like
what legitimate.
when you look at Daniel, you can tell it's from the Hellenistic period just because all the idioms that are in there.
Yes.
Any expert in the language is right away. They're like, there's no way this is written in 5 or whatever
Right.
400.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It doesn't fit a Babylonian context or a
yeah,
Persian context if you get into the ideas, or the register, even though it's Aramaic, it's still a Greek contextual Aramaic.
right.
That's happening there. So what I've done here with this journal, these are all peer-reviewed data sets. So these were scrutinized by other scholars and accepted for publication. And the data sets themselves are in the Harvard Dataverse. So there are 12 different data sets. So we now have actual Marcion gospel data that we can use, that scientists can use to start to analyze and correlate these data. Now, what I published are really kind of starter data sets. They're not the richly tagged, like there's no syntactical tagging. I'm not looking at like, all the relationships between words. It's just individual word tags of like, what's the part of speech, and then what's the form or the morphology in Greek. And then what's the lemma, what's the root word. But that work that I did, basically like manually tagging most of this data, it's still really rich and really valuable. You can see things in the data that you would not otherwise see just by reading a Greek text, and certainly not by looking at an English translation. But computational linguists out there should know that just because something's in Greek doesn't mean you can't analyze it. Even if you don't know Greek, you can still do things like transliterate all the Greek letters into English letters, and then just look at the patterns. Even if the words don't make sense to you in English, they can just be English letters, but you can still see the same underlying patterns, right? There's no problem with transforming data, to do analysis. In fact, sometimes new things open up when you do that kind of thing. So that data is out there, and we can now start to do serious scientific work on Marcion's gospel as it relates to other Christian traditions. And we need to do the same thing for a bunch of other texts too, like Gospel Peter, Gospel Thomas. Why are there not standard digital, like richly tagged digital editions that are public, in the public domain for people to do this kind of analysis? And I would say it just shows the malaise of our discipline, that we're not actually in our discipline interested in doing science. And so, we have all these wonderful resources for the canonical texts, but usually they're distributed in like private software.
Hmm.
There's a couple like Logos or Accordance. So these are software vendors that make a lot of money selling software to pastors that helps them do analysis of Greek texts, but they're not really interested in scientific, like pushing
Right.
scientific boundaries or asking tough scientific questions.
Yeah.
They're not interested in Marcion's gospel at all. So you're not going to find Greek data sets of Marcion's gospel in those software programs, because like those software tools have a vested interest, I think, in like reinforcing a dialogue that's faith
Yeah.
based and faith centered rather than legitimate scientific inquiry.